really know anything. I mean, seriously, think about it. How do you actually separate what you feel totally certain about, the bedrock truths of how you see things, from stuff you just, well, assume?
It's a tricky question.
Right. And what if the things you feel most certain about, cause and effect, reality itself? What if they aren't actually based on pure logic or reason?
Yeah.
What if they're built on something, I don't know, a bit more psychological?
That's the kind of rabbit hole philosophers love, isn't it? And it really gets to the core of, well, how our minds work and how we connect with the world. We go through life making all these assumptions, right?
Yeah.
About why things happen, that objects stay put, that our senses aren't lying to us, that, I'm still me from one day to the next.
Yeah, we just take it for granted.
But when you actually start poking at why we believe all that stuff, the ground can start to feel pretty shaky underneath.
Absolutely. And today, we're diving into a work that didn't just poke at those foundations. It, took a philosophical sledgehammer to them.
Yeah.
Purposefully, dramatically. We're talking about David Hume's An Enquiry, an inquiry concerning human understanding.
Welcome to the deep dive. Yeah, this is a big one. For this exploration, we've pulled together quite a bit, key bits directly from the inquiry itself, naturally, but also some background on Hume, biographical stuff and analysis comparing this work to his earlier writings, placing it in context.
So think of this as your guided tour through Hume's philosophical revolution. Our goal here is to take all this source material, boil it down to the really crucial insights, and unpack the, well, sometimes pretty unsettling ideas Hume brings up about where our beliefs actually come from. We want to give you a clear, hopefully engaging, and solid grasp of why this work was such a big deal and why it still matters, without getting bogged down in super dense academic talk.
Sounds good. So maybe the best place to start is why Hume wrote the Enquiry in the first place. Because it wasn't his first shot at philosophy, was it?
No, definitely not. His first sort of grand statement was a treatise of human nature. Came out in 3 books, 1739, 1740. He was incredibly young, actually. And this was meant to be, the big one, his masterpiece, a whole science of human nature based on experience.
Yeah, his magnum opus.
Yeah.
But the reaction, well, let's just say it wasn't exactly what he'd hoped for.
Understatement of the century.
Probably. Hume himself had this really famous, kind of brutal way of putting it. He said the treatise fell dead-born from the press, without reaching such distinction as even to excite a murmur among the zealots.
Ouch. Dead-born.
Right. Imagine pouring years into something you think is revolutionary, and it's met with basically silence. Or worse, indifference.
Yeah, that's gotta hurt.
Yeah.
But here's the crucial thing, right? Hume didn't think the ideas were the problem. He felt it was the presentation. Maybe too dense, too long, too radical all at once.
Exactly. He wrote later that he had always entertained a notion that my want of success had proceeded more from the manner than the matter. He thought the core substance was right, but the style, the delivery, was off.
And that directly leads us to the Enquiry.
It does. It first came out in 1748, titled Philosophical Essays Concerning Human Understanding. Then later, in 1758, it got the title we know, An Enquiry Concerning Human Understanding. And his whole aim was to take the main arguments, especially from Book 1 of the treatise, and present them in a, slicker package. More accessible, more concise, more polished. He wanted people to actually read and engage with his ideas this time.
And he really backed this horse, didn't he? The sources point out that whenever people asked him about his philosophy students, critics, whoever, he consistently pointed them towards the Enquiry.
He did. And there's this advertisement he wrote for the 1777 edition, published just after he died. He makes this really strong statement about the treatise, calls it a juvenile work, which the author never acknowledged.
Wow, never acknowledged. That's basically disowning it.
Pretty much. And he says that the Enquiry and some other later essays may alone be regarded as containing his philosophical sentiments and principles. So he clearly wanted his mature legacy to be based on this later, more refined work.
It's fascinating, though, that he framed it as just a difference in manner. Because, the Enquiry isn't just a shorter treatise, is it? The analysis we have suggests the scope and even the emphasis changed quite a bit.
That's a really important point. It's definitely not just an abridged version. The Enquiry streamlines things significantly. Some big topics from Book 1 of the treatise, things like detailed arguments about substance or the immateriality of the soul, complicated stuff about space and time, certain types of deep skepticism, they were either cut completely or, seriously trimmed down in the Enquiry.
So he chopped out some of the more maybe purely academic or intricate bits.
Seems like it. But it wasn't just subtraction. The Enquiry also brings in new material that wasn't in the Treatises book at all. The famous section on miracles, section 10, that's the prime example. It wasn't really there in the treatise like that.
Okay, so it was a genuine reworking, not just a cut and paste job.
Definitely a revision, a refinement. And the overall feel is a bit different too. The treatise had this really explicit mission statement, an attempt to introduce the experimental method of reasoning into moral subjects, like applying Newton's science to human nature.
Right. Very ambitious.
Super ambitious. And while that empirical approach is definitely still there in the Enquiry, that kind of grand, unifying, this is the science of man banner isn't waved quite so prominently. It's still systematic, but maybe less programmatically stated.
But even with those differences, the core philosophical enemy is the same in both books, right? Our sources say the main target for both the treatise and the Enquiry is the destruction of what can be called dogmatic rationalism.
Yes, that's the common thread. That's what Hume is really going after.
Okay, let's unpack that term, dogmatic rationalism. What exactly was Hume fighting against?
Well, think about the big philosophical names on the continent at the time. Descartes, Spinoza, Leibniz, and also some thinkers in Britain. The core idea of rationalism in this context was that human reason, just by thinking, operating a priori meaning, independent of sense experience, could figure out fundamental truths about reality, like really big truths.
The idea that you could just sort of sit in your armchair and reason your way to knowing how everything works.
Pretty much. They thought reason had these amazing powers to establish, with certainty, things like the existence and nature of God, the ultimate structure of the universe, maybe even timeless moral truths, or the deep-down nature of things like substance, all through pure logic or intellectual insight without needing to, go out and look at the world.
And Hume thought that was just
Yeah.
overblown, arrogant maybe.
Completely unwarranted in his view. He looked at these elaborate systems built by rationalists and thought they were resting on shaky foundations. They claimed their starting points were self-evident or logically necessary, but Hume argued, hang on, where are you actually getting this from? He believed the only legitimate sources of knowledge were experience and the logical connections between our ideas. He felt these rationalists were making huge leaps, claiming knowledge they couldn't back up empirically.
And it wasn't just the famous continental rationalists he was targeting.
No, our sources mention he felt even some empiricists who came before him, like Locke and Berkeley, slipped into similar dogmatic habits sometimes. Like Berkeley uses his philosophy to promote belief in God, or Locke relies on God's goodness to guarantee our senses are reliable. For Hume, these were still appeals to metaphysical assumptions that hadn't been proven by experience. Hume wanted to clear the decks entirely, get rid of all assumptions not strictly grounded in experience or logic.
Okay, so if dismantling dogmatic rationalism is the mission, what's his first move in the Enquiry? Where does he start the attack?
He starts right away, in section 4, by drawing a fundamental line in the sand. He says, look, all the objects of human reason or inquiry may naturally be divided into two kinds, to wit, relations of ideas and matters of fact. This distinction is absolutely crucial. It's the lens through which he's going to examine everything else.
Relations of ideas and matters of fact.
Okay.
Let's make sure we've got those straight. Relations of ideas first.
Right. These are things like geometry, algebra, arithmetic, math, basically. Also logic. These are statements that are intuitively or demonstratively certain, meaning their truth is either obvious just from understanding the terms like a bachelor is an unmarried man, or you can prove them through logical steps, like a mathematical theorem.
Okay, so truths of definition and logic.
Exactly. And crucially, their truth depends only on the ideas themselves. It doesn't matter what exists in the real world. Like, the Pythagorean theorem is true whether or not perfect right-angled triangles actually exist anywhere physically. And the negation of a relation of ideas is a logical contradiction. You can't even properly conceive of a square circle or 3 + 2 = 6. It breaks logic.
Got it. Analytic truths. True by definition.
Yeah.
So what about matters of fact?
Totally different ballgame. These are about existence, about what's actually happening in the world. Their truth is not logically certain. You can't prove them just by thinking. And here's the key. The opposite of a matter of fact is always conceivable. It never implies a logical contradiction.
Okay, give me an example.
Hume's classic one is the sun. The statement, the sun will rise tomorrow, is a matter of fact. We believe it strongly based on past experience. But the opposite statement, that the sun will not rise tomorrow, Hume says, is no less intelligible a proposition than the affirmation that it will rise. Right. I can totally imagine the sun just not coming up. It would be bizarre, terrifying maybe, but I can picture it. It's not like imagining a four-sided triangle.
Exactly. It doesn't break logic to conceive of it. And Hume stresses that all our knowledge about matters of fact, everything we know about the actual world, is founded entirely on experience. Any reasoning we do about them, any predictions we make, are founded entirely on experience. This is the realm of science, history, everyday life.
So pretty much everything we normally think of as knowledge about the world falls under matters of fact. Physics, biology, history, geography, even just figuring out what to do next.
Yes, all that involves reasoning about existence and relies on experience. Hume mentions that theology tries to mix both, using experience, like miracle claims, but also faith. And things like morality and art criticism, he thinks, are maybe more about taste and feeling, which we'll get to. But this basic distinction, relations of ideas versus matters of fact, is Hume's fundamental tool. And he uses it to show that a lot of what we think is solid knowledge about matters of fact isn't actually derived from reason or experience in the way we assume.
Precisely. He's setting the stage to argue that our beliefs about the world are often based on something quite different. And to understand that something different, we need to go back even further to the absolute basics. Where do our thoughts even come from?
Which brings us to section 2 of the Enquiry, right? The origin of our ideas. This is where he lays out his core empiricist belief. The difference between impressions and ideas.
Yes, this is Hume setting up his mental toolkit. He says, look, all the contents of our minds, all our perceptions can be divided into two categories based on their force or liveliness. Impressions and ideas.
Okay, impressions. What are they exactly?
Impressions are, as he puts it, all our more lively perceptions when we hear or see or feel or love or hate or desire or will. So it's the immediate stuff. Direct sensations, the bright red you see, the warmth you feel from a fire, the loud bang you hear. But it also includes our inner experiences as they first happen. The feeling of anger bubbling up, the surge of joy, the act of wanting something. They're characterized by their strength and vivacity. They hit you hard.
Okay, the raw data feed of experience, both outer and inner.
Pretty much. Now, ideas are the other category. They are the less lively perceptions of which we are conscious when we reflect on any of those sensations or movements above mentioned. So ideas are like the faint copies, the memories, the thoughts about those initial impressions, remembering the red color, thinking about the feeling of anger later, having the concept of joy based on past feelings. Compared to impressions, they are naturally faint and obscure.
So the difference between actually feeling pain and just thinking about pain. The feeling is the impression, the thought is the idea.
You got it. And this distinction leads him straight to his fundamental rule, what's often called the copy principle. Hume makes this really bold claim. All our ideas are copies of our impressions.
Meaning, every single simple idea we have, the basic building blocks of thought must have started out as a corresponding simple impression.
That's the core idea. He admits we can form complex ideas by combining simple ones, like imagining a golden mountain by combining the idea of gold from an impression of gold and the idea of a mountain from an impression of a mountain. But the basic ingredients, the simple ideas like goldness or mountainous or redness or roundness, must have originated from a prior impression. You can't have an idea of something in its most basic form if you haven't experienced the corresponding impression through your senses or feelings.
That sounds sweeping.
Yeah.
How does he try to back that up?
He offers two main lines of evidence, basically appealing to observation. First, he says, just look into your own mind. Take any idea, no matter how abstract or complex, and try to trace it back. He thinks you'll always find it's built up from simpler ideas, and those simple ideas ultimately correspond to some prior feeling or sensation you've had.
It's like my idea of justice. That seems pretty abstract.
Right. But Hume would say, okay, what's involved there? Ideas of fairness, rules, harm, benefit, approval, disapproval. Trace those back. Where do they come from? Ultimately, he thinks, they link back to impressions, feelings of sympathy, experiences of social order or disorder, feelings of pleasure or pain associated with certain actions.
Okay, that's the first argument. What's the second?
The second argument is based on absence. He points out that if someone lacks the sensory input, they also lack the corresponding ideas. A person born blind doesn't just lack the impression of colors, they lack the idea of colors altogether. They can talk about colors, use the words, but they don't have the concept in the same way someone who sees does. Same for someone born deaf in sounds. Or, he suggests, someone constitutionally incapable of feeling, say, resentment wouldn't really have the idea of resentment. No impression, no idea.
That seems like pretty strong evidence for the connection.
He thinks so. It strongly suggests ideas depend on prior impressions.
But hang on, didn't he mention a kind of counterexample? That famous thing about the missing shade of blue?
Ah, yes, the missing shade. He does bring it up. He imagines someone who's experienced every single shade of blue except one specific shade. Could that person, just by arranging their existing ideas of blue in their mind, conjure up an idea of the missing shade without having had the direct impression of it? Hume concedes that, yeah, maybe they could. It seems possible.
So that breaks the copy principle then.
Well, it's interesting. Hume presents it, acknowledges it, but then almost immediately dismisses it as unimportant. He calls it so singular. It is scarcely worth our observing, and does not merit, that for it alone we should alter our general maxim.
So he basically says, yeah, there's this one weird little exception, but let's ignore it because the rule works almost all the time.
That's pretty much his move. He emphasizes that the mind certainly has power. The imagination has the command over all its ideas and can join and mix and vary them in all the ways possible. We can imagine flying pigs or virtuous horses. But he insists, the basic ingredients, the simple ideas we're mixing and matching, goal, mountain, horse, wings, must come from original impressions. The imagination rearranges existing material. It doesn't create entirely new, simple ideas out of nothing, except maybe that one blue shade.
Okay, so the copy principle is about the origin of the raw materials of thought, not about limiting creativity with those materials.
Exactly. It sets a limit on what our ideas can fundamentally be about. And this is where it becomes incredibly useful for Hume's whole philosophical project.
How so? Why is this copy principle so important for him?
Because he sees it as a powerful tool for cleaning up philosophy. He thinks a lot of philosophical confusion and debate comes from using terms vaguely, without clear ideas attached to them. He calls it jargon. The copy principle gives him a test, a sort of philosophical bullshit detector.
Okay, how does the test work?
He says, whenever you come across a philosophical term that seems murky or suspicious, maybe being used without any meaning or idea, as is but too frequent, you just need to ask one simple question. From what impression is that supposed idea derived?
Show me the impression.
Exactly. Find the source experience. And Hume says, if it be impossible to assign any, this will serve to confirm our suspicion that the term is basically meaningless. It's just a word masquerading as an idea with no real connection to experience.
So when philosophers start talking about things like substance or essence, or maybe certain ideas of self or God, Hume's challenge is, okay, point to the specific impression, the sight, sound, feeling, whatever that this idea is copied from, and if they can't,
then Hume is deeply suspicious that it's just empty talk, sophistry, and illusion. He believes this principle can bring clarity, expose nonsense, and ground philosophical discussion firmly in experience.
And applying this rigorous test, demanding the impression, leads him directly to his most famous and probably most shocking argument: his attack on our understanding of cause and effect.
Yes, this is the absolute core of the inquiry, especially sections 4 and 7. It's the argument that really shakes the foundations of how we think the world works and how we know anything beyond our immediate senses.
We all just naturally assume causes lead to effects, right? Like flicking a switch causes the light to come on, pushing a domino causes the next one to fall. There's a connection, a power involved.
Right. We feel there's some kind of necessary connection or power or force in the cause that makes the effect happen. The first event compels the second.
It feels obvious. Like, just look.
But Hume says, let's really look. Let's apply the empirical method strictly. Let's take his famous example. One billiard ball hitting another. What impressions do we actually receive when we watch that happen?
Okay, well, I see the first ball moving towards the second. I see them touch. Then I see the second ball move away.
Exactly. Hume breaks it down into what we actually observe. 1, contiguity. The balls are close, they make contact. 2, priority. The first ball's motion happens before the second ball's motion. 3, constant conjunction. We've seen this kind of sequence motion, impact motion happen over and over again in the past with similar objects.
Right. Contact, sequence, repetition. I definitely observe those.
Okay, but now the crucial question. Do you, at any point, have a distinct impression of the necessary connection itself? Do you see or feel the force passing from the first ball to the second, the power that makes the second ball move?
No, I see the first ball move, then I see the second ball move. They seem linked because it always happens that way. But I don't actually see the link itself. There's no impression of causal power floating between them.
That's Hume's point. One event follows another, he says, but we never can observe any tie between them. They seem conjoined, but never connected. Or think about bread. You see its color, feel its texture, taste it. But do you perceive the secret powers inside it that make it nourishing? No. You only know it nourishes you because you've experienced the effect, feeling nourished, after the cause, eating bread, many times.
Okay, so if we don't get the idea of necessary connection or causal power from an impression of something out there in the objects or events, where does that idea come from? We certainly have the idea.
This is the brilliant and radical move. Hume says, since the idea isn't copied from any external impression, it must be copied from an internal impression, something we feel inside ourselves.
An internal feeling. Like what?
It arises, he argues, after we've experienced the constant conjunction many times. So after seeing ball A hit ball B, and then B moves again and again and again, what happens in our mind? Through sheer repetition, through habit or custom, our mind develops an expectation. The next time we see ball A moving towards B, our thought is automatically carried from perceiving the cause, A moving, to expecting the usual effect, B moving. We develop a mental habit.
So the repetition builds a pathway in the mind, basically.
Yes, and that feeling, the feeling of the mind being carried along, the feeling of expectation, the internal sense of transition from cause to effect that habit creates, that, Hume argues, is the internal impression from which we copy our idea of necessary connection or power.
Whoa. Let me see if I get this. The necessary connection isn't something real between the objects. It's a feeling in my head produced by watching them repeatedly.
Exactly. He puts it like this. This connection, therefore, which we feel in the mind, this customary transition of the imagination from one object to its usual attendant, is the sentiment or impression from which we form the idea of power or necessary connection. It's a psychological feeling, born of habit.
So all our confidence about cause and effect, the feeling that A makes B happen, isn't based on insight into reality, but on mental conditioning.
That's the core of it. Hume is quite stark. Nothing farther is in the case. Our belief in causality is fundamentally non-rational. It's based on custom, habit, this feeling of expectation. Even belief itself, for Hume in this context, isn't a purely rational thing. It's more like a vivid feeling, a certain force and vigor that an idea gets when it's produced by this customary process, making it feel real and guide our actions.
This just pulls the rug out from under so much of what we think we know. If reason doesn't guarantee cause and effect, what does? It seems to lead straight to the problem of induction.
It absolutely does. This is one of the biggest philosophical problems Hume unleashes. If our belief that, say, dropping this pen will make it fall is based only on past experience, it always fell before, and the resulting mental habit, why are we justified in assuming the future will be like the past?
Right. Just because it happened a million times doesn't logically mean it has to happen the next time. The laws of physics could theoretically change at midnight.
Hume makes exactly that argument. Our deep-seated belief in the uniformity of nature, the assumption that the future will resemble the past, cannot be proven by reason. It's not a relation of ideas. Its opposite is perfectly conceivable, sun not rising, gravity reversing. It's not a matter-of-fact proven by experience either.
Why not by experience? Haven't we experienced the future being like the past countless times?
But trying to use past experience to justify our reliance on past experience is circular reasoning. Hume points out that all inferences from experience suppose, as their foundation, that the future will resemble the past. To argue that the future will be like the past because in the past, the future turned out to be like the past, well, you're already assuming the very principle you're trying to prove.
You're begging the question. Okay, so the most basic assumption underlying all our reasoning about the world, that patterns will continue, can't be justified by reason or by experience without circularity.
That's Hume's stunning conclusion. All our inferences about matters of fact that go beyond our immediate senses and memory, which includes all science, all prediction, all planning, are ultimately founded on custom, habit, psychological instinct, not on rational demonstration.
That is profoundly unsettling. It reframes scientific knowledge itself, grounding it in psychology rather than pure logic.
It really does. It marks a major shift from the rationalist confidence of the previous era. And Hume doesn't just apply this to billiard balls and bread. He takes this analysis of causality right into the heart of human action in Section 8 of liberty and necessity.
So he thinks human choices and actions work the same way.
He argues that if you look empirically, you see the same patterns. Human actions seem to be constantly conjoined with certain motives, character traits, and circumstances. We routinely infer actions from character or motives from actions based on our experience of these regularities.
Like, if I know my friend is terrified of spiders and there's a big spider on their chair, I can predict they probably won't sit down.
Exactly. We do this constantly. And Hume says the necessity we attribute to this connection, the link between the motive circumstance and the action, is the same kind of necessity we find in physics. It's just the constant union and conjunction we observe, plus the inference of the mind that results from that observation. It's regularity and predictability based on experience.
So human actions aren't exempt from this causal necessity. They follow predictable patterns, just like physical events.
That's his controversial claim. He then tackles liberty or free will. What does freedom mean if our actions are necessary in this sense?
Usually we think freedom means we could have done otherwise. Real choice.
Hume defines liberty differently. He calls it a power of acting or not acting, according to the determinations of the will. If you will to raise your hand and nothing stops you, you are free to raise it. If you will to stay seated and you can, you're free to stay seated. He calls this hypothetical liberty freedom to act, if you will it. He thinks everyone agrees we have this kind of liberty unless we're, say, chained up.
Okay, freedom to do what you decide to do.
Right. But, he argues, if you define liberty as something opposed to his kind of necessity, the constant conjunction, the predictability based on motives, then liberty becomes the same thing as pure randomness or chance. And he thinks everyone agrees that human actions aren't just random chance events. They arise from motives and character.
So the choice is, either our actions are predictably linked to our motives, Hume's necessity, or they're completely random and inexplicable chance. And neither of those sounds like the kind of free will people usually want.
Precisely. Hume argues his view necessity as regularity, combined with liberty as the power to act on your will, is the only coherent position. In fact, he argues, things like moral responsibility and the law depend on this necessity. How could you praise or blame someone or use rewards and punishments if their actions weren't reliably connected to their character and motives? Society assumes that these motives have a regular and uniform influence on the mind. That reliable influence is causality, is necessity in his sense.
So far from destroying responsibility, his view of necessity actually makes it possible.
That's his argument. He does acknowledge, though, that this raises tricky theological issues. If human actions are part of a necessary chain going back to a first cause like God, does that make God responsible for everything, including evil? He flags this as a major objection his view faces, but doesn't fully resolve it in the inquiry.
Okay, so this rigorous empiricism reshapes causality and free will. Does it also mess with our belief in the external world? You mentioned skepticism earlier.
It certainly raises sectical challenges, yeah. This comes up particularly in section 12. Remember Hume's starting point. The mind is only ever directly aware of its own perceptions, impressions, and ideas. Nothing is ever really present with the mind but its perceptions.
Right. I don't see the tree. I see my impression of the tree.
Exactly. So the big question is, how can we ever know if these internal perceptions are caused by or even resemble actual external objects that exist independently out there? If all I ever have access to are the contents of my own mind, how can I peek outside to compare my perception with the supposed real thing?
It seems impossible by definition.
Hume agrees. He argues experience is and must be entirely silent on this. We never experience the external object and the internal perception together to see if they match or if one causes the other. So our belief that perceptions come from external objects can't be based on comparing the two. His argument about causality applies here too. We can't infer an unobserved cause, external object, from an observed effect, perception, without seeing them constantly conjoined, which we can't do.
So why do we all believe so strongly in an external world then?
Hume puts it down to a blind and powerful instinct of nature. We just naturally assume our perceptions are the objects, or at least accurate copies. Philosophers try to justify this, like Locke distinguishing primary qualities, shape, size, supposedly resembling the object, from secondary qualities, color, sound, just effects in us. But Hume's critique undermines the link for all qualities. Can we really know our idea of shape resembles an external shape if we only ever experience the idea?
And appealing to God, saying God wouldn't deceive us with our senses.
Hume sees that as circular. If you're doubting your senses and reason enough to question the external world, you can't then use arguments based on senses or reason to prove God exists to guarantee those senses. If the external world be once called in question, we shall be at a loss to find arguments by which we may prove the existence of that being. Ultimately, for Hume, the belief in stable, independent objects is a product of instinct and habit, incredibly useful for life, but not rationally provable.
And this skepticism extends even to our idea of ourselves, our personal identity.
Yes, it's a similar application of his core principles, though perhaps less emphasized in the Enquiry compared to the Treatise. Again, apply the copy principle. If we have an idea of a continuous, unified, enduring self or soul, where is the impression it's copied from?
I feel like me, but is there one single feeling of me-ness that never changes?
Hume argues no. When you introspect, what do you find? A constant stream of changing perceptions, thoughts, feelings, sensations, memories, one after another. You never catch the self itself standing apart from these perceptions. Drawing on the treatise, he says, we have no idea of substance of any kind, since we have no impression of any substance, either material or spiritual. Our idea of the mind is just an idea of these particular perceptions, not some underlying substance.
So the feeling of being a continuous self is also not based on a direct impression of that self.
That's his skeptical conclusion. He suggests the strong belief in a unified self comes from the way our imagination links these rapidly succeeding but related perceptions together. Because the perceptions are linked by resemblance and causality, memories of past feelings, thoughts leading to other thoughts, the mind slides smoothly along the chain. This smoothness makes us mistakenly bundle the collection of related perceptions together and think of it as one single enduring thing, the self. It's like confusing a parade with a single marcher.
So the self is like a bundle of perceptions connected by psychological habits, not an unchanging entity.
That's the challenging picture his empiricism paints. It questions the very foundation of what we mean by I.
Okay, from these really fundamental, almost dizzying questions about knowledge and self, Hume also turns his attention to more specific, practical applications of his principles. Section 10 on miracles is probably the most famous example.
Oh, definitely. It's incredibly controversial both then and now. Here, Hume applies his ideas about evidence, experience, and probability to evaluate claims of supernatural events.
How does he start? What's a miracle for Hume?
He defines a miracle quite straightforwardly as a violation of the laws of nature.
Okay, and laws of nature are?
Remember, for Hume, laws of nature aren't discovered by reason as necessary truths. They are conclusions based on uniform experience. When we have observed consistently and without exception that certain events always follow others, like fire burning wood or unsupported objects falling, we establish a law of nature based on this firm and unalterable experience.
Got it. Laws, summaries of totally consistent past experience. Now, what about testimony, people claiming they saw something?
Our trust in testimony is also based on experience. We generally believe what people report because in our past experience, there's usually been a conformity of facts to the reports of witnesses. We've learned that people tend to tell the truth, memory tends to be reliable, etc. But this trust isn't absolute. The strength of testimony varies. Sometimes it's strong, proof, sometimes weak, probability, depending on how consistently reports has matched reality in the past, and on specific factors like the witness's character, number, potential motives, and whether their stories conflict.
Okay, so we weigh testimony based on our experience of its reliability. How does this apply to miracle claims?
Hume says a wise man proportions his belief to the evidence. When someone reports a miracle, a violation of a law of nature, you have a conflict of evidence. On one side is the testimony for the miracle. On the other side is the evidence against the miracle.
And the evidence against the miracle is?
It's the uniform experience that established the law of nature in the first place. It's the vast body of evidence showing that, say, dead people don't come back to life, or water doesn't turn into wine. This uniform experience is the strongest possible evidence we can have for any matter of fact.
So it's the testimony versus the weight of all past experience regarding that natural law.
Exactly. And Hume argues that the evidence against the miracle, the uniform experience, will always, by definition, be stronger than the evidence for the miracle, the testimony. To believe the miracle report, the falsehood of the testimony would have to be more miraculous, more contrary to experience than the event itself.
Which seems incredibly unlikely. Is it less likely that someone is mistaken or lying than that a fundamental law of nature was broken?
That's Hume's point. He concludes very bluntly, no testimony for any kind of miracle has ever amounted to a probability, much less to a proof, and that, consequently, no miracle has ever been wrought in any age or country. The weight of evidence establishing the natural law will always outweigh the testimony claiming its violation.
And he doesn't just leave it at the general principle. He gives specific reasons why miracle testimony, especially the religious kind, tends to be particularly dodgy.
Yes, he lists several factors that should make us suspicious. Miracle reports often come from ignorant and barbarous nations, suggesting a lack of critical thinking. Humans, he says, have a natural love of wonder and surprise, making us gullible to extraordinary tales. These stories often serve to promote a particular religion, giving people a strong motive to invent or exaggerate. He makes this cutting remark. As the violations of truth are more common in the testimony concerning religious miracles than in that concerning any other matter of fact, this must diminish very much the authority of the former testimony. Basically, history shows people lie more often about religious wonders.
So applying his empirical method to the history of miracle claims suggests they are inherently suspect.
That's his argument. And then there's the killer argument, really, but the problem of opposing testimony.
Right, different religions claim different miracles to support their exclusive truth.
Exactly. If a miracle is supposed to prove religion A is true, it simultaneously acts as evidence against religion B, which claims its own miracles proving it's true. They can't both be right. As Hume says, all the prodigies of different religions are to be regarded as contrary facts, the evidences, as opposite to each other. They effectively cancel each other out.
It's like witnesses contradicting each other in court.
Precisely. And he uses a couple of historical examples, not necessarily to mock them, but as case studies in how to apply his reasoning about testimony.
Like the story about the Roman Emperor Vespasian curing people, reported by the respected historian Tacitus.
Yes. Hume acknowledges the apparent strengths, Tacitus's reputation, the public nature of the events, witnesses apparently sticking to the story even after Vespasian's family lost power. On the surface, it looks like decent historical testimony.
But Hume still rejects it.
Absolutely. He calls it a gross and so palpable of falsehood. Why? Because, ultimately, it supports what he considers an exploded and idolatrous superstition, Roman paganism. The sheer improbability of the event, violating natural laws about disease, combined with the dubious purpose propping up a false religion, outweighs even Tacitus's generally reliable reporting. It's more probable Tacitus was misinformed or the witnesses exaggerated than that the laws of nature were suspended for Vespasian.
And the other case, the Jansenist miracles in 18th century France.
Right. Miracles supposedly happening at the tomb of the Abbé Paris. Hume mentions reports from credible-seeming people, even someone described as skeptical, Cardinal de Retz. Yet Hume uses this example to show how zeal and enthusiasm can completely overwhelm people's judgment. When religious fervor is involved, he argues, there is no degree of human testimony so strong as may not be procured for the greatest absurdity. He also notes, with some sarcasm, that comparisons were drawn between these contemporary miracles and biblical ones, suggesting that if you take the comparison seriously, it might actually undermine the biblical accounts by subjecting them to the same harsh scrutiny.
So the bottom line for Hume on miracles is, the evidence against them, the uniformity of nature, is always intrinsically stronger than any possible evidence for them. Human testimony, which is known to be fallible, especially when religion and wonder are involved.
It's a stark, probabilistic argument based entirely on his understanding of evidence derived from experience.
Okay, moving from supernatural claims to a more everyday but equally fundamental area, morality. How does Hume apply his empirical, anti-rationalist approach here?
He uses the same basic toolkit, remember, relations of ideas versus matters of fact. He argues morality doesn't fit neatly into either category in a way that would ground it in pure reason. Moral judgments aren't like math theorems. You can't logically deduce murder is wrong from definitions alone.
And they aren't just objective matters of fact either, like discovering the boiling point of water.
No. This is where his famous thought experiment comes in, drawn from the treatise. Take an action universally condemned, like willful murder. Examine it closely. Describe all the observable facts, the intention, the motive, the physical action, the result. You can list all the scientific and psychological details. But Hume asks, where in that objective description do you find the vice, the wrongness itself?
It's not a physical property you can point to, like the color of the blood or the speed of the bullet.
Exactly. The vice entirely escapes you, Hume says, as long as you just look at the object, the external facts. So where is it? You never can find it, he claims, till you turn your reflection into your own breast and find a sentiment of disapprobation which arises in you towards this action.
It's internal again, a feeling.
Yes. The wrongness isn't out there in the action, it's in here, in the feeling the action produces in the observer. Here, as a matter of fact, he says, the feeling is a real psychological fact, but it is the object of feeling, not of reason. It lies in yourself, not in the object.
So for Hume, vice and virtue are not qualities in objects, but perceptions in the mind. They are based on feelings of approval or disapproval that arise when we contemplate actions or characters.
That's the core of his moral sentimentalism. He even compares it to the modern understanding of secondary qualities like color and sound. We now know they aren't inherent in objects, but are effects in our perceptual system. Hume thinks he's done the same for morality, shifting it from supposed objective properties to subjective responses.
But wait, if it's just based on feeling, isn't morality completely subjective? My feelings are mine, yours are yours. And some feelings aren't moral, like I might feel pleasure seeing my rival fail, but that's not moral approval. How does he distinguish moral sentiments?
Good point. Hume acknowledges this. Not every feeling of pleasure or pain counts. The key, he argues, is the perspective from which the feeling arises. A moral sentiment emerges when we consider a character or action in general without reference to our particular interest. We have to adopt a kind of impartial viewpoint.
Step back from our own selfish concerns.
Yes. And this is where sympathy comes in, a concept really central to his moral theory, especially in the treatise. Sympathy is our natural human capacity to share or resonate with the feelings of others. When we judge morally, we don't just think about how an action affects us. We use sympathy to consider how it affects others, how it impacts the well-being of society as a whole.
So we imaginatively feel the pleasure or pain the action causes for people generally.
Right. It's this combination, considering things from a general, disinterested point of view, and sympathetically resonating with the likely consequences for human happiness and social welfare, that produces the specific feelings of approval for what's beneficial or agreeable, or disapproval for what's harmful or disagreeable, that constitute our moral judgments. Morality is grounded in our shared human nature, our capacity for sympathy, and our recognition of social utility.
That makes sense. It's rooted in feeling, but not just arbitrary personal feeling. It's feeling shaped by impartiality and concern for others. The source material mentioned an example comparing natural virtues and justice.
Yes, that distinction, again, clearer in the treatise excerpt, helps illustrate it. Natural virtues like benevolence or kindness are motivating feelings that lead directly to good outcomes in individual acts. Helping someone out of compassion feels good and does good immediately.
Straightforward.
But justice is trickier. Think about property laws. A single act of enforcing a property law might seem unfair or unhelpful in isolation. Maybe taking from a poor person to give to a rich person who legally owns something. That single act doesn't necessarily spring from warm, fuzzy feelings or produce immediate good.
Right, it can feel harsh.
But, Hume argues, we approve of justice because we recognize, through experience and sympathy with the broad interests of society, that the entire system of rules governing property, contracts, etc., is incredibly useful, even essential for social order and cooperation. It's the overall utility of the system that generates the strong moral sentiment approving of justice, even if individual acts seem counterintuitive. So moral approval is tied to what tends to promote human happiness and social advantage, perceived through sympathy.
This also seems to connect to the is-ought gap he's famous for pointing out. You can describe what is. People act in certain ways, have certain feelings, but you can't logically jump to what ought to be. You should act this way. That leap requires a sentiment, a value judgment.
Exactly. Reason can analyze the facts, the is, but it can't on its own generate the ought. That requires the input of feeling, of moral sentiment, which reflects our human responses to how actions impact well-being.
Okay, so Hume's whole project uses this sharp empirical lens to critique reason's role in causality, the external world, self, miracles, and morality, grounding them instead in things like custom, instinct, and sentiment. This naturally leads to him being called a skeptic. But he's careful to define his own brand of skepticism, right? Especially in section 12.
He is. He wants to distance himself from what he calls Pyrrhonism, or excessive radical skepticism, the kind that doubts absolutely everything, including the reliability of senses and reason itself. Hume thinks that kind of extreme skepticism, if anyone could actually maintain it, would lead to total paralysis. You couldn't decide or do anything. It would mean all human life must perish.
But he thinks it's basically impossible to live that way.
Yes, he's quite dismissive of it as a practical philosophy. Nature is always too strong for principle, he says. Our instincts, habits, the basic needs of life inevitably force us to act and believe. A game of backgammon, a good meal, a conversation, these things instantly dispel those radical doubts. He sees extreme skepticism more as a philosophical exercise, an amusement that shows the whimsical condition of mankind. We have to live and believe, even if we can't give rock-solid, rational proofs for our most basic beliefs.
So what's his alternative? The more mitigated, skepticism or academical philosophy?
This is Hume's preferred stance. It learns from the arguments of radical skepticism, learns about the limits of reason, but it's moderated by common sense and reflection. It doesn't demand we abandon all belief, but it encourages caution and intellectual humility.
What's the value of this mitigated skepticism?
Hume sees several benefits. It cures us of dogmatical arrogance, especially regarding those big, abstract, metaphysical questions about God or ultimate reality that he thought reason couldn't handle. It teaches us to confine our inquiries to such subjects as are best adapted to the narrow capacity of human understanding.
Stick to what experience and careful logic can actually tell us. Relations of ideas and matters of fact.
Precisely. Focus on everyday life, empirical science, mathematics, logic, areas where we can actually make progress. Leave the unprovable, abstruse stuff alone because it only leads to uncertainty and error. This mitigated skepticism acknowledges that we do operate on beliefs based on custom and instinct, like causality, external world, because we have to, but it reminds us that these beliefs don't have the stamp of absolute rational certainty we might wish they had.
So it's a practical skepticism. It helps us understand the real, often non-rational foundations of our beliefs, but then guides us to use our reason effectively within its proper limits.
Exactly. It's about intellectual honesty and focusing our efforts productively. And this whole approach, this critical examination of human understanding, had a massive impact on philosophy going forward.
Hume definitely aimed high. The sources mention he hoped his work would produce almost a total alteration in philosophy.
He certainly wasn't shy about his ambitions, and while maybe not total overnight, the influence was profound. Thinkers like Immanuel Kant famously said, "Hume awakened me from my dogmatic slumber," directly crediting Hume with shaking up his acceptance of rationalist metaphysics and setting him on the path to his own critical philosophy. That connection has often highlighted the Enquiry doing for a wider audience what the treatise started, much like Kant's Prolegomena simplified his critique.
High praise from Kant. But Hume faced a lot of flack in his own time too, right?
Oh, absolutely. Intense criticism. People like James Beattie attacked him fiercely for promoting skepticism and atheism. He was denied university positions because his ideas were seen as undermining religion and morality. His contemporaries recognized how radical and challenging his conclusions were to the established ways of thinking based on reason and faith. The fact that Hume kept revising the Enquiry over many editions shows how seriously he took presenting his arguments clearly, perhaps partly in response to these criticisms.
Yet, despite the controversy, the core questions he raised about the limits of reason, how belief works, the role of habit, the basis of knowledge and morality, are still completely central today.
They absolutely are. They force us constantly to re-examine what we mean by knowing something and how we justify our beliefs about a world we only experience through our limited human faculties.
And the inquiry ends with this incredibly bold, almost shocking final statement, a kind of litmus test for all knowledge based on his principles.
It's truly one of the most provocative endings in philosophy. After summing up his arguments, he imagines applying his empirical test to entire libraries.
How does he put it? It's quite dramatic.
He asks, "When we run over libraries persuaded of these principles, what havoc must we make?" Then he lays down the rule. If we take in our hand any volume of divinity or school metaphysics, for instance, let us ask, does it contain any abstract reasoning concerning quantity or number? Meaning, is it like math or logic? No. Does it contain any experimental reasoning concerning matter of fact and existence? Meaning, is it based on experience, like science or history? No. His conclusion, commit it then to the flames, for it can contain nothing but sophistry and illusion.
Wow. Burn the books if they aren't math, logic, or empirical science. That is intense.
It's incredibly intense. It's Hume's ultimate fiery challenge to centuries of theological and metaphysical speculation that he believed failed his fundamental test for meaningfulness. If it's not a relation of ideas or matter of fact grounded in experience, he argues, it's worthless, just deceptive nonsense.
A really powerful, if maybe hyperbolic way to drive home the central message of the inquiry. Stick to experience and logic. Beware of abstract speculation.
It certainly leaves a lasting impression and crystallizes his whole project.
So just to wrap up this deep dive into Hume's inquiry, we started with his goal.
Yeah.
A clearer, more accessible version of his philosophy, aimed at taking down dogmatic rationalism by revealing reason's true limits.
We covered his crucial fork in the road, relations of ideas, logic, math, certain by definition, versus matters of fact, the world, known via experience, never logically certain.
We looked at his empiricist foundation, vivid impressions of the source. Faint ideas are copies, the copy principle, which acts as his filter for meaningful concepts.
Then the big one, causality. His argument that necessary connection isn't observed externally but is an internal feeling, a mental habit born from experiencing constant conjunction.
Which leads to the problem of induction. Our reliance on the future resembling the past is based on custom, not reason. And we saw this applies to human actions too, connecting motives and behavior through experienced necessity.
We touched on the skeptical consequences for our belief in an independent external world and a unified self, suggesting these deep beliefs are rooted in instinct and psychological habit, not rational proof.
We examined his famous argument against miracles, using probability and the weight of uniform experience, laws of nature, to argue against the reliability of testimony for supernatural events.
And we saw how he grounds morality not in reason, but in sentiment, feelings of approval or disapproval arising from sympathy, and a general point of view focused on social utility.
Finally, we place his philosophy as a mitigated skepticism, one that recognizes reason's limits and the non-rational basis of many core beliefs, but encourages focusing on empirical inquiry and practical life, rather than paralyzing doubt, and ending with that fiery call to purge libraries of anything not grounded in logic or experience.
It's a work that fundamentally reoriented philosophy, posing questions about knowledge and belief that we're still grappling with today.
Absolutely, it really forces you to think. So the final thought for you, listening. Based on Hume's sharp analysis, take a moment. How much of what you believe about how the world works, about right and wrong, about what's real, how much rests on solid reason or direct experience? And how much might be built on habit, on feeling, on assumptions you've absorbed, but never really questioned through that Humean lens?
It's a challenging question, one that encourages a kind of intellectual honesty, looking both at the world and, perhaps more importantly, at the workings of our own minds.